Recording in progress.
Thank you, everybody. If we could sit down, we could start on time.
Nice to see you. We'll start off with Mike.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's in lieu of Pat.
in lieu of Pat, but
And
probably should not use the slides if I haven't seen.
you should use the slide.
Oh, I should. I've never seen them. What's
Oh,
in
I
the
was told you
slides?
knew. All right. So our second session is going to be devoted to a topic that's already come up. It's probably the most controversial aspect of the discussion over homeschooling is whether or not the government should get involved and whether or not the government should be providing education savings accounts. And this is becoming increasingly prevalent. One state after another is adopting it, and my guess is that it's going to continue over the next few years, no matter what happens in Washington, because so much of this stuff happens at the local level. So we've got a great panel to get the conversation started. We're going to try to hold everybody to about 8 minutes, if you would, and then that'll give us time for discussion. So we're going to begin. We're going to follow the program here. Myles Mendoza will start off. He's the founder and president of the Oak Rose Group. Then we're going to go to Lori Openshaw. She is the co-founder of Orchid STEM School. And then, if Patrick Wolf arrives by this time, he's landing somewhere, and he's from the University of Arkansas, and he will wind it up. And if by chance we don't have Pat Wolf here, we will ask Mike Petrilli to stand in, because he was already weighing in on this topic in the last session. So we'll give him a little more time. He tried to wheedle that into the opening session, but we'll give him a full time to discuss it, but no more than 8 minutes, Mike.
I understand.
So, okay, so let's begin with Myles.
Sure, and thank you, Paul, and thanks to Harvard for having me. Those are words I didn't expect to come out of my mouth too readily. So as background, I just want to kind of give where we're going to talk a little bit about universal school choice and whether that will be captured by the affluent or whether that really opens up opportunities for all. In my own personal career, I started off as a social worker, working at the Children's Hospital, working for low-income communities as a caseworker. My life has been dedicated to low-income populations who have been deprived of opportunity. So that is a placeholder in my soul. But as I advanced in my career and started looking at the opportunities that low-income children were getting, more and more it became clear to me that there were challenges that were structural, that were very hard to overcome. For a long time, I worked for a group called Democrats for Education Reform. And at Democrats for Education Reform, I traveled around the country looking to build infrastructure so that there were more financial supporters, more advocates, more elected officials that were advocating for school choice, essentially, among a variety of various policies. In 2013, and this is kind of before a lot of other things started happening in society, I was recruited to come to Illinois to help work on private school choice. So essentially crossing the Rubicon in terms of democratic policies and starting to really provide more opportunities that low-income kids needed, especially in places like the city of Chicago, where many kids in neighborhoods have a better chance of going to prison than they do of going to college. But the big challenge was trying to capture not only the smattering of Republicans that were in leadership or coming into leadership going into 2017 when we finally passed the private school choice law, but it's trying to get to the moderate Democrats. Our Republican Party in the state of Illinois, they're called Daily Democrats. So they don't quite look like a Republican, but they're willing to go along as long as you can build the support for them to kind of air cover to get away with it. So for us, what that meant was getting the support of private trade unions to join a coalition. So in Chicago, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Bring a teacher or a private trade union to a teacher union fight, and it can help provide the air support that legislators need. So we were able to get the support of 53 private trade unions to join the coalition, and by proxy, what that also did is it helped to bring in the working class. So advocates for the history of my career up until that point when things started changing had been advocating for low-income populations almost exclusively, or at least as a priority. But now, enter in a police officer and a nurse, all of a sudden you have a little bit higher income population with representation in trade unions who are looking to advocate for the advancement of that policy. I would credit that, among many other things, as one of the major influences as to why in 2017 Illinois legislators were willing to pass a private school choice law. So we were able to pass that law, raise about $400 million, send tens of thousands of kids to school. The plan at that point was for the private trade unions, they really wanted to start diversifying their forces, making sure that their workforce was prepared for the future. COVID kind of threw a lot of the plans off the rails to start building private trade schools, so a lot of that got delayed. In 2023, our Governor Pritzker, he ended up killing the private school choice policy. So I would point in large part to our failure to actually implement that private trade school as one of the reasons why it failed. Had we been able to advance, it's happening, and there are kids now entering into their sophomore year of trade school in a private Christian school. But had that advanced faster, I think it would have been impossible for the governor to remove the policy, because he would not only be removing it from some of those higher income kids, but he'd also be taking it away from the trade unions who had really needed this asset. So I think, the question, which I think is kind of a bit of a false question, is, will universal school choice be captured by the affluent or open up opportunities for all? And, my position is, well, I hope it gets taken up by the affluent. When I look beyond Illinois and what should have happened and didn't happen that killed the policy, I also look at the 11 states that have advanced universal ESAs. I think in large part what we have seen is an activated base that we haven't seen before. You have social issues. Prior academic performance was kind of the litmus test as to why a parent would want to get engaged. And whether it was true or not, people believed their local school was performing in the suburbs. Post-pandemic, schools weren't open. Kids were in school, parents are looking over their shoulders, looking at the screen, looking at the content, watching the social environments that they're interacting in, going against their own family values. Now all of a sudden, you don't just have lower income populations who are upset about the academic quality that they're being offered. Now you have middle and upper income families who are activated, they have power, they have influence, and they have the ability to get policy moved. I would argue that a large part of why we're seeing that those 11 states advance universal ESA is because they're activated on things that are relative to their backyards. Just kind of in the last chapter, and in a second I'll hand it over to Michael. I think that this is the beginning, and certainly there's the great divide, polarized red states and blue states. Blue states are turning back school choice, and red states seem to be advancing that. But if you look at states like Colorado or Arizona, and you look at their charter history, the chartering that occurred in places like those, they're hitting middle and upper income populations. They have not only STEM schools, but they have experiential learning, they have Montessori charters. There's a variety of charter schools that are satisfying constituents that, again, power and influence. And if you look at places like Chicago or New York, there is no longer an offensive strategy from the school choice sector, because those schools are beholden majority to low-income populations who don't have the power and influence that the upper middle income populations have. I think there's a little bit of hope. In those populations, those cities, I can say specifically for Chicago, there's certainly a newly activated Jewish population. I know in my neck of the woods, they canceled Holocaust Remembrance Day post October 7th. Hyper controversial, it's a left of center audience, and became extremely activated. I think most of that was on reforming the current system and trying to depoliticize, but you do have a large share of unusual suspects, kind of like a trade union, who are now active in Democratic base, trying to advance school choice in ways that I haven't seen before. So I think, again, there's a lot of bad news. There's a lot of politicization in our education system, but the good news is you do have a more activated base in a higher income threshold that's making more things possible than they were before.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Myles. That was great. So my position on this panel is kind of a boots on the ground. I own and operate a small micro school in Utah, just like an hour south of Salt Lake City. We are like right on the edge of civilization before you get to the desert. And so my background is in engineering. I have a master's degree in bioengineering and did my research with NASA on like space flight, and all of it just kind of like pushed me further and further towards education. And after a PhD in education, I understood that I didn't necessarily want my children in public education. And so I've partnered with like a longtime school teacher who's also kind of pulled away from public school for his own reasons, and we've opened a small micro school with 12 students that is heavily focused on science, technology, engineering, and math, and is outdoor based. And so we spend a lot of time outside doing projects, and we've had such a great response from our community. And one of the big reasons we opened it was that our community is incredibly fast growing. I know, Michael, you shared last time that like numbers are down across the nation, and I happen to be in one of the bubbles that is rapidly expanding. So our city has gained 24,000 new residents in the last 5 years, and the average age of our city is only 24 years old. So, there are so many children, and as you might have guessed, Utah typically has more children than average states. And so many of our families are large, and many of our families are looking for something outside of the public school model. And in my community that is pretty rural, I married into a farm family. My husband, we have about 50 acres of fruit orchards, and that's where our outdoor portions take place. And there are no options in our community. We have 3 elementary schools for our 30,000 residents, no junior highs, no high schools, everyone is bused. And so we also push out the other communities who are in the community of their high school. They are bused to a different school. And so we are growing too fast for the public education system to keep up. And conveniently, Utah just passed a sweeping measure for a school voucher program. They call it a scholarship. Michael, plug your ears for this part. It's $8,000. And so Utah has been kind of unique in that they pushed it through with a lot of opposition. They tied the scholarship into like a raise for public school teachers. And so no one was willing to vote down raises for public school teachers. And so we passed it by a landslide with a lot of controversy. And still, it's not quite enough for many of the like new schools to open. And one of the things that they tried to kind of temper some of the critical feelings with was designing it so that low-income families get first dibs. And so every single scholarship this year went to a family that was below 200% of the federal poverty line. And so for a family of 4, that's about $68,000. And so every single one of our students at the micro school is low income. And one of the tricky things about not opening it to higher income families is that we are limited in the tuition and the resources and all of the things that we can provide because we can't really go over that scholarship amount. Families simply can't afford it. All right, Michael.
Thank you. First of all, Laura, it sounds like a lovely place that you get to live. Maybe the next year we can do the conference there.
Yes.
In the fruit orchards. Sounds great. All right, well, I am not Patrick Wolf. I apologize. He may be bursting through the doors at any moment. I've never been mistaken for Patrick. He's great and would have talked about the data on this, I'm sure, and I'd be curious. So I did write, though, recently in Education Next in a forum with Darrell Bradford about this question, about whether we should be we should be embracing education savings accounts or other forms of private school choice for everybody, universal, or still on a targeted means-tested basis. And I took the argument that we should keep limiting it, or at least that there should be a compromise. So first, let me talk about the reason to limit it. And it's very simple. I mean, when we started this 30 years ago, a lot of us, the argument was rich parents already have school choice. Right? They can't afford to write those tuition checks. They can afford to buy a house in the fancy suburbs where the public schools are excellent. The problem was that poor families, working class families, didn't have those same choices. They could only live where the housing was affordable, and then they were kind of stuck with whatever schools were provided to them. And they didn't have real political power, therefore, up against the school systems, the teacher unions. They just had to take what they had. And that school choice, the hope was going to change those power dynamics. And I think that we have seen that has, to a large degree, worked, both in the private school choice world, but also in the charter school world. Lots of studies now showing that as more kids participate in these programs, it does put positive competitive pressure on the school systems. It feels to me now that we're talking about universal, that it does feel like a big switcheroo, right? And not in a good way. Now, look, I will be honest with you. Part of this gets very emotional for me. When I hear about student loan forgiveness, that's basically untargeted, that's for everybody, or up to very high income levels, it pisses me off. Right? I mean, I think, what? You're making $250,000 a year and we're going to forgive your loan? And by the way, according to the polls, it looks like it pisses a lot of people in America off, right? The popularity of those provisions has gone way down. People feel like it's not fair. People knew what they were doing when they were taking out loans. They end up making much more money because they're college educated, yada, yada. Some of these policies and proposals in blue states to give everybody free lunch, it drives me crazy. The government shouldn't be paying for my kids' lunch. I can pay for their own lunch. And the reason this kind of pisses me off is that, it's just these age-old fiscal conservatism. I'm also now a dad. Money doesn't grow on trees, right? We do not have unlimited resources, and we have to make decisions. And so, if we have scarce resources, we should be careful about how we spend those resources. If we need to do student loan forgiveness for people who have been targeted by unfair for-profit universities, okay, or low-income people, okay, or public service, we can talk about that, right? Of course, we should provide lunch for hungry children who come from poor families, right? But rich parents? And so the same thing here, right, is that to say that we have a system where we are going to now send millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to families who are among the wealthiest families in our society, who have already been sending their kids to private schools without a lot of difficulty, just because feels like something that is hard to justify and hard to afford. Now, I understand the argument, the sort of philosophical argument that says, hey, it should be backpack funding and strap it to the back of the kids. And, if you go to a fancy public school, the public's paying for your... I get that. And if we were designing a system from scratch, I think we could have those debates, But the reality is we are not, right? And so what at least is happening right now in places like Arizona is that we are writing checks to very wealthy families, to subsidize the private education that they've been paying for all along. And if you've got 2 or 3 kids, 8,000 times 2 or 3 times 13 years of schooling, that's a lot of money. And I think it's reasonable to ask, like, what is the public getting for that money that could be spent in other ways? Now, the compromise, I think, is to think in terms of progressive funding, just as we do in the public school world, right? I think on both sides of the aisle, people now would say, yes, of course, the states should provide more money to school districts that don't have the ability to raise that money on their own because of low property values, because of low incomes. So the states have to pick up more of the share. For very affluent districts, they pay more of their own, right? And you could actually tie some of the school choice programs explicitly to the state funding formula. You could say, okay, let's say that there's a very affluent district that spends whatever, $15,000 or $20,000 a year per pupil, but they only get $3,000 a year from the state. Okay, the rest is raised locally by basically taxing, a bunch of wealthy people in the value of their homes, right? All right, so then keep that same thing in mind. The state pays $3,000 for those affluent districts. Maybe the state should pay $3,000 for the most affluent kids, right? On the other hand, for the high poverty districts, the states might be paying $15,000 or $20,000 per pupil, and that's what it should pay in the private school choice world as well. Now, Ohio, and I understand maybe Oklahoma as well, but I know the Ohio system better. We do now have a sliding scale like this. It's not quite as extreme as I've painted it, but it's basically $6,000 or $7,000 for the poorest kids, depending on grade level, and then it goes down to about $600 per child for the wealthiest families. And there's a sliding scale, and it's pretty generous. I mean, you go pretty high up in the income into middle-class families, still get the full amount. But it has the benefit, I think, both substantively and politically, of not sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the state's wealthiest families. That saved Ohio something like $300 million in 1 year, which, if had that provision, had they gone the Arizona route, it would have cost something like 65% more than it did. So that's real savings. And my argument would be you get the political benefits, the wealthy families get a little something, but you don't get the political downsides of it being viewed as a giveaway to the rich.
All right, so I know, Lori, you sort of wanted to react a bit to that idea. So do you have a thought?
I do. So I do agree that wealthy families may not need the money for school. But I also think it's hard to say that lower income families need it. We have public school available, and it is available. They provide free lunch, they provide busing, they provide after school programs. And many of our low income families who receive the scholarship can't make a new school choice because there aren't those same provisions that public school provides. Not every family has 2 parents who stay home. We run a 4-day-a-week program. It requires someone to be home on Fridays. We only run 9 to 3. Someone needs to pick up their children. We don't have buses. We don't provide school lunch. Someone needs to pack a lunch. And so all of these arguments that only low-income families should receive the full benefits, I think ignore some of the facts that low-income families, even with the benefits, can't attend.
So Myles, do you have a reaction?
Yeah, I mentioned I used to be a Democrat for education reform, and I crossed the Rubicon. There's a lot of Democrats still in me, so I think about what would the teachers' union say? Would they ask, how are we going to pay for this? I don't think that they would. And I think the other thing that's really important, in working in Chicago, I've spent a long time working in low-income communities. Poor people generally don't want to go to schools with exclusively poor people. They would much rather go to a mixed income situation. So again, the private school sector really needs to draw from the charter school playbook. And if you look at Colorado, if you look at the great schools, DSST being, I'll give an example in Denver, purposefully mixed income, killing it. Low income kids are killing it. And the reason why is because you have shared experiences, you have intellectual diversity, which is just critical for a low income kid to be able to perform, to be exposed to more. And I think part of where, and I know Michael and I probably agree more, but I'll play it out. I think these phase-in bills, essentially it's, let's have all the appearance of universal so we can get that political support of middle and upper income people, but you have to satisfy poverty first. Like, good luck. It's going to be a long time before you get to that place of filling up that bucket. And so I think it's a little bit of a false advertising to call something universal when it's going to be phased in and it's going to take a long time. And then the last piece, which I think you would also take on prioritization, would be special needs populations. And again, it's going back to those democratic principles and what would the teachers union say. If you have a special needs population and you give them an $8,000 scholarship compared to what is happening in the public system, it's not really an opportunity. Maybe it is for that higher income family that could use that funding to supplement all of their money they're spending out of pocket. But it's only in places like Ohio where you see significant dollars going to follow those kids with special needs that allow schools and the supply side to emerge. If you don't have that financial backing, you won't see the supply side.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see if our audience has any questions they would like to ask. Lots of hands go up. Okay. So, right here. We have we're waiting for a mic to arrive. Okay, can you speak up?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Yeah, my teacher voice. This question, I think, is for Italian Mike.
Yes.
I'm sure you're,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm
Yes.
sure you're stunned to be asked, but so you mentioned, and I'm going to butcher the way you said it, and
Yep.
Myles, you've got back to this too, that increased participation from the parents' side, can drive improvement on the supply side. So I don't know, but I think just by sheer numbers, even on a universal program, getting back, to the question of this session, it's true, maybe the affluent families don't need the scholarship, but is there something to be said for the fact that there will be way more lower and middle income families who benefit, and the also benefit to the affluent families because of the improvement that is driven on the supply side?
Yeah.
That's the good that comes from it.
Yep. Yeah, no, I'm glad. Thank you. Look, I think that supply side question is the big one, right? Because what we have right now, it is kind of awkward, is that we have all these families that have been paying tuition all along, right? And then suddenly they get this enormous public subsidy. And so we say, again, what did we get for that? Now, yes, maybe play that out down the road that encourages other providers to come into the market. Yeah, maybe that's true. But keep in mind, in a lot of these red states, the way this is happening is it's states that had targeted programs, or maybe, and they were first pretty limited to just poor, and then they went to working class, and they went to middle class, and they've been raising. That's how it happened in Ohio, I think Indiana, some of the others. So it's, I don't know. I just think it's hard to, as you go up that income scale, you end up serving more and more kids who are already in the private schools, right? And then we have these debates. Well, should you have to spend a year in public school in order to get the money? But that's awkward and doesn't seem fair. So, how do we get past this period where a huge amount of the money, right, about the captured is getting captured by the affluent because they were the ones already in private schools, right? And because, they are the ones benefiting most by raising those income eligibility caps. And I guess you're saying, yes, but it will be worth it if we somehow dramatically expand the supply. And that's an open question. Maybe. But is that how we could most expand supply, is by making rich people eligible? Or would it be by, for example, becoming more generous with the voucher amounts for, low income, working class, and middle class? I mean, to me, I think you see in the charter sector, one thing that you really need to pay attention to is you got to make sure the money is enough, right? And if we would try to do private school choice in a stingy way, then you're not going to see a supply response either. So there's trade-offs. And in my mind, the more important thing would be to get the money up much higher for those low-income kids so that you could afford a bus, so that
Michael,
you could do the...
I'm going to interrupt you at this point because I heard you at the last session say that you didn't want a generous ESA account. You said you wanted to keep it small.
If it's a ESA for like a la carte education, if it's a school tuition, if it's a tuition voucher, tuition scholarship, I think you can hold those schools accountable for results. I'm more comfortable with a big one.
Okay, so you don't want ESAs. You want school tuitions, and then you want accountability at the school. And if you have ESA accounts, you want to have little money, and you don't want to give it to anybody except poor people who can't afford to go to any school.
Well, my compromise is a sliding scale. It's very complicated. I wrote about this in Education Next.
Okay, further questions? Yes, back there. Yeah.
I can yell too. Thank you all. It's such a fascinating conversation. I think we're in danger here of following the errors of the charter school sector, right? Charter school sector obviously is open to all, but focused for a long time on low-income urban areas. And because of that, and this is just a pragmatic argument, they didn't wind up having higher affluent, influential families, suburban families, et cetera, invested in the sector and willing to advocate for them. And I think we've seen what's happened in the charter sector, right, with increasing regulation, bogged down by, they've taken away a lot of freedoms over time, and not really having, giving them the kind of true charter bargain that was originally struck to give them autonomy. And so my fear is that if we do not allow upper income families to access these programs, we are boxing ourselves out strategically just from the politics of it, of actually expanding these programs over time. Those are families who will rally for you, organize for you, show up. They have influence with legislators. I live in Utah. Lori, it's great to see you. That is a key factor, right? And right now, Lori's right, it's 200%, but there are 17,000 families sitting on a waiting list right now, knocking at the door, including families at my own school. I'm a chair of the board of a small micro school, and they are waiting to get in. And some of them have actually, we have had to dip really deep into our budget to offset with financial aid. And they're middle income families, right? These aren't families who are, making millions of dollars a year, but we live in an expensive area of the state, and they don't have the funds. So I think, there's a pragmatic argument here around kind of the politics of it and being able to make the case for these programs to stick around for a long time. And then I will just end by saying I also think philosophically, right? Like, if we believe that every single kid in the United States should have access to the school that's right for them, that involves opening these programs up fully and universally. And I'm sorry that was a comment and not a question. I would love your reactions. Thank you.
We'll take that as a comment on my comment. So, yes, right here in the front. Yeah.
I appreciate the panel. I am Democrat for School Choice from Ohio, but I basically lived Lori's life of running a program now for 29 years called North Star in Western Mass. It's a homeschooling-based program. Our top tuition is around $9,500. It's barely enough to pay real wages, right? If we can average $8,000 to $10,000 from scratch, you're in the marketplace of paying reasonable wages to your staff. If you're averaging $5,000 or $6,000, you're probably not able to pay sustainable wages for a long period of time. My concern, and by the way, in Western Mass, which is super liberal, everybody loves school choice, right? Every choice option, from charters to inter-district school choice, is oversubscribed. Everybody loves school choice. They may not say that out loud politically, but they do with their behavior, including affluent families who are also oversubscribing the charter schools. But if we can't get more Lori people to open more homeschooling programs, I'm sorry that you're not going to like this, but where I live, the private schools are $25,000 to $45,000 to $50,000 a year, whether they're Montessori or Deerfield Academy. Giving $8,000 to families is a drop in the bucket to $40,000 tuition. And what possible public good are we defending in doing that? What It seems a tough argument to begin with, but that seems to make it tougher. And $8,000 to $10,000, if it's an ESA, that can help more people like Lori and myself sponsor more homeschooling accessible programs for people who wouldn't do it without us. That's real bar. And then you can charge, $2,000 to $5,000 sliding scale on top of it for some. Maybe you can't, but maybe I could get away with $2,000 to $5,000 on top of an $8,000 ESA. That's real radical change. So but I am worried about ESA money being $8,000 to $10,000 just if there's not more supply side, just going straight into Deerfield Academy, raising their fees $8,000 and building another pool. Like what? How is that a civic good? Is my question.
All right, good. Well, again, another comment. Yes. Anybody have a question?
So I have an actual question.
Inflection at the end.
And
That's all you need.
thank you for everything. My question is, and maybe it was more applicable for the last panel, but what kind of research has been done or is being done for kind of what is the obstacle for folks not choosing alternative schooling? And is it just financial? We're kind of focusing on the affluent and opportunities for all, but is that the actual obstacle for families, or is it awareness, or is it cultural, or is it not thinking that they're deserving? When we're talking about low-income families, there are a lot of things that come into play that aren't just money. So I'm curious about any research being done or thoughts you guys have on that.
Well, yeah, Lori, let's throw that one to you. Yeah.
So I can share some of the qualitative research that we've gotten back from members in our community and within our county. One of the primary drivers against school choice for families and pulling their kids out of public school is cost, obviously. Most families rightfully cannot afford $10,000 just added to their annual budgets. But there are other issues specifically with our community that kind of pull back to what I shared before, that not every private school or micro school or homeschool co-op can provide the same services that a public school does. If you have a child who has an IEP or a 504, we can't accommodate every accommodation that a student might need. My school specifically meets outside. Patrick.
I'm out.
So we specifically meet outdoors, and so it's very difficult for students with mobility challenges. We don't have an accessible vehicle. We travel in a large passenger van. Other things that families have shared is that there is a stigma associated with private schools, that it's for those families, the wealthy families, the Prescotts who wear their plaid Easter brunch sweatshirts everywhere. And it's not real. In my community, it's not real. We are a suburb. Our cost of living is large, and most families make less than $200,000, and a townhome subdivision that's opening near us, the starting costs around $450,000 for a 2-bedroom townhome. And so we don't have those wealthy families that families might be worried about their kids interacting with and maybe picking up some perceived bad habits. And so I think a lot of the issue is perception along with costs.
So Patrick, thank you for joining us. We've been filibustering in your absence, and we're grateful to Italian Petrilli for standing up here and taking brickbats and tomatoes and so forth. So you've come to his rescue. So we have 20 minutes. We'll give you 6.
Okay, and I need a clicker for my slides.
I don't know which one it is.
Yeah, the bad news was this morning I had an over 2-hour flight delay on my connecting flight. The good news is I had a really charming female taxi driver who told me all about her colonoscopy and her recent kidney surgery of her kidney stone. So, there's...
All right, 1 minute's gone. Move on.
Okay, so... all right. And...
Oh, it might be the other one then.
Is it this one?
it's the other one. Okay. go. All right. So I'm very proud of this slide. I think it's Ladnerian in its complexity. And basically, it's a depiction of recent developments in the private school sector. So the blue bars, the blue parts of the bars, represent fee-paying private school enrollments in the United States. The caps, the orange caps on top, are students supported by private school choice programs. So the bar, the entire height of each bar is total private school enrollments since the millennium, the turn of the millennium. And I think this tells us a lot about the supply of private schooling and the importance of private school choice programs for supporting the private school sector. You see, back in 2001, there were hardly any students in the private sector being supported by choice programs. And then, of course, the dot-com crash happened, and so it was more difficult. It was difficult for folks to afford private schooling. Enrollments dropped, and they dropped even more dramatically after the Great Recession. And from 2008 till 2021, Catholic schools, the Catholic school system closed almost 1,100 schools. So a lot of traditional supply was taken off the market. And we see that the private school sector has never reclaimed its enrollment totals that it had prior to the Great Recession. The choice programs are simply sort of keeping it from declining further. So that's the supply side story. And we see that basically the proportion of students enrolled in private schools who are being supported by choice programs is up to 14% of all private school enrollments in the United States. That's 2023. Since then, another 300,000 students have entered school choice programs, so we're certainly in the neighborhood of 16 to 17%, rapidly approaching 1 in 5 students in the private school sector supported by choice. So that's the supply side. But what about the demand side? What are the students, particularly students participating in the new universal choice programs? Well, we have a little bit of descriptive information about these students. This is from EdChoice, and we've got 5 of the universal school choice programs that have been enacted, that have been launched recently. These are the descriptive statistics available about their enrollments. You see there are some sort of not reported things that are sort of frustrating. But the key takeaways, I mean, when you look at this basically is that at least a third of the students enrolling in the universal programs are switching out of public schools. So it's not just subsidizing the students currently in private schools. There's a substantial number of public school switchers in these programs. Nearly a third of students in some of these programs are rising kindergartners. And of course with them, we don't know if they would have gone to the public schools without the program or if they would have gone to private schools without the program. So we don't know the proportion of switchers for kindergarten students, but policymakers think that prioritizing kindergartners for these programs it's very popular with policymakers because then the family doesn't have to switch the child later on and the child doesn't have to go through the disruption of changing schools, changing school sectors. So they can go straight through from kindergarten on. And then you know, roughly a third to like 40 to 45% of the students are current private school enrollees. Now, in many cases, that includes students who enrolled originally through a choice program. So like in Arkansas, 44% of the students currently in the second year of our private school choice program, our universal ESA program, have a disability. And that's because the program's being implemented gradually and any students who were already in our disability voucher program were the first priority for enrollments. So the private school sector needs to be prepared to serve particular types of students who are the early enrollees in these programs, particularly kids with disabilities, particularly kindergartners and kids in the lower grades. I mean, those are the kids who are flocking to these programs right at the jump. And so I think it's important that you have programs that Myles is very familiar with, programs that Lori is implementing that are these dynamic, innovative, new supply kinds of programs coming online to serve kids in universal choice programs. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, lots of hands were up before. Right there.
So one of the concerns that I have and is for priority enrollment is what happens when private school students are easier or quicker to adopt and join these ESA programs because they don't have the switching costs. And in states where there's a limited amount of seats, will we not see a disproportionate amount of these limited amount of ESA seats filled by private school students who don't have to wait for the school year to end, who don't have to go through the pain of switching their child out?
Sure. Well, and policymakers are aware of that concern. That's why all of these universal programs, you don't go universal overnight. There's always a rollout. And with all of them, there is a prioritization system that prioritizes students with certain disadvantages. So it kind of reminds me of it's roughly consistent with the system of universal school choice that Jack Koons argued for back in the 1970s, which was he argued for universal school choice with every participating private school had to reserve a certain number of seats for disadvantaged kids, for income disadvantaged kids. That was Jack Koons' model. Well, what policymakers are doing with universal school choice here is they're allowing disadvantaged kids to be the first movers, to get the first shot at the excess capacity in participating private schools. And now you might be concerned that, well, then the really good private schools will wait until that prioritization system is done and then grab the more advantaged kids. But we're seeing overwhelmingly most private schools in these states are joining the programs the first year, when the only students who can enroll are kids with disabilities, kids attending F schools, kids from low-income families. And there are very few private schools that hold out until the programs are fully universal. So we're not seeing a lot of bad actors so far in terms of gaming the system, and we're seeing a lot of kids from difficult situations taking advantage of these universal school choice programs and getting there first before they're opened up to everyone.
I would jump in there. I think when you look at the largest player in the space for private school choice is Catholic schools. So when a private school choice passes, the Catholic system is playing catch up from the competition that they had with charter schools. So yes, they're using funding oftentimes for current students. I would also argue that there's not an offensive strategy for Catholic education. I always like to say, when Catholic enrollment dies or is decreasing, as a school choice law is passed, they're using the money to plug holes in sinking ships. There isn't a growth strategy, but I think now I'm starting to see purposeful growth strategies in very large states that look like they're about to pass private school choice. And so most of the states have been the dog who caught the bus. Okay, we weren't prepared. We have the school choice law. Let's grab the money and plug the holes. So it's only now that the boats are staying afloat. So you've retained the supply, but you haven't grown the supply. I think the goal in a place like Texas, for example, is that you start off on offense, ready to actually have a purposeful growth strategy. Again, taken from the charter playbook, there's incubators. There's a purposeful recruitment of entrepreneurs like Lori, preparing them with curriculum, recruitment, finance, and then, dare I say, capital. Capital, Catholics have buildings that they can use. The rest of the private school sector does not have buildings. And again, I'd go back to my democratic principles and saying, hey, we should be investing in the capital side of things so that we can actually have a supply side, or at least allow the private operators to operate in those public school buildings.
Yeah, in the front row.
Hey, thank you guys so much. I'm just curious to know, I'll give you a little context. I've been running The Realm now for about 14 years, which is one of those hybrid something schools where we get a lot of homeschoolers and doing a lot what you're doing, Lori. And we've had continued enrollment ever since day one. We started with one student 14 years ago. Now we're up to 150 every semester, and over 4,000 kids have come through our doors. And part of the trick, one, is real estate. Paying for our building, we're in the middle of Los Angeles. So, I mean, just throw the number out there. We spend about $24,000 a month just to have 3,000 square feet of space to do what we're doing. And so then, of course, students sort of have to become the commodity, which I think is a horrible model for education. All that to say, one of the ways we've gotten around, and I'm curious to know what you guys feel about this, is that we have a lot of our students who attend non-brick and mortar charter schools. When they attend those charter schools, then they're allotted a certain amount of money, which averages about $3,000 a year, that they then can spend on any programs that they want. So they can use it for school books, they can use it for online programs, and they can use it at the Realm. So that's what we've been doing, and it's allowed us to take in some lower income students because we really do want to continue to be a microcosm of the world and not just an elite, because that makes no sense. Those aren't the kids we're trying to grow. I don't know if this is going to last. California notoriously is a place that really does, wants to continue to push public education. I understand why, but I'm just curious to know how you guys feel about that type of program. The benefit is, comes to what Italian Mike was saying. There is assessment there. Then, the kids are a part of a charter school. They have to take yearly state tests, and what it does show is that they're thriving in our program. So I just want to throw that out there.
Well, basically that's a backdoor ESA. Yeah, and Gavin Newsom just texted me that he's going to put an end to it.
I know. No, I shouldn't have even said it out loud.
Great. And I guess that just shows choice finds a way. Yeah. It finds a way, and parents really value choices. Many kids really need them. And even in a state that is so restrictive on school choice, parents and savvy school administrators find a way.
Yeah. If I can just add, I think that might be a future for every state. Yeah. So in Utah, 10,000 kids got the scholarship, and there are almost 20,000 children waiting, hoping. And of our 12 students in my school, 4 of them received the state scholarship. And the remainder are enrolled in a similar charter school that is homeschool-based, and we are a provider. And so on the numbers side of things, the charter school receives money, they send us $6,000, and so we are eating $3,000 per student in tuition reductions. And so it's one way that we can kind of force a universal option early on when we're trying to roll things out and families are not pleased with that. And at the same time, it really hampers the supply side of things because we are getting less funding per student, and there isn't a simple path for us to expand using that model.
All right, over here.
Hi, thanks everyone. So it seems like there's a hypothesis here that maybe if you're trying to convince Italian Mike, I can't believe we're all calling you that, Mike, but okay. Or other skeptics of universal programs, which I would probably put myself in that boat, that the hypothesis is if you open the door to the affluent families from the beginning, it gives longevity, and then over time we'll see, right, an increased presence of perhaps more mixed income families, right? More income diversity within private schools over time. Like maybe you say we're going to excuse the first couple years of Arizona being all these affluent families because we think over time, right, at the entry points of kindergarten and ninth grade. So my question is kind of, what is the time frame? Like if you're trying to sell someone who's on the yes but train of I'm not sure how I feel about this, is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is there a point at which it's reasonable to say we've been trying this for a certain amount of time, we are or are not seeing the kind of diversity in enrollment, access to programs, sustained growth of micro schools and things like that?
So I mean, I'm of personal opinion that the phase-in type strategy is kind of, it just can last forever. I think most people who believe in school choice believe in the development of a market, and I can think of no market where the product was only designated for low-income people. I mean, if the iPhone were developed that way, I mean, Facebook, social media, it started at Ivy Leagues, it started with the elite, and then it made its way to everybody. But there just is no other market that starts off only exclusively in a low-income population and that somehow finds its way to everybody else. It doesn't happen.
Yeah, so first, just truth in advertising. Liz is a former student of mine. I taught her to give me softball questions.
How'd that lesson land?
Didn't go over very well. So, I mean, I see there are two cross pressures that are generating demand for universal school choice programs. I mean, on the one hand, as Liz was suggesting, I mean, you have higher income families who have higher socioeconomic status and, more of them are two-parent families. There are just more resources to navigate the school choice experience and the demands of exercising school choice. So they're better equipped to take advantage of it. But then you've got disadvantaged families whose, residentially assigned school is really pushing them. So you've got the needy families are more motivated to make the switch. The more advantaged families have better resources to negotiate it. And so it's hard to predict exactly how those two cross pressures are going to interact. There's probably going to be a mix of students, but it does suggest just programmatically, we do have to take seriously programmatic supports for under-resourced families, informational supports. There's a school choice navigator is kind of the new idea. I think it's a great idea. It's coaching parents through the school choice process, as long as they don't take over and, in parental loco and locus. It's been a long day. My Latin isn't so good right now. Still, that colonoscopy story. But I think that's what we're going to see, and it also resonates with Dick Murnane and his team did that study a few years ago. There was that article in Education Next about the private school sector was hemorrhaging middle-class families. It wasn't hemorrhaging low-income enrollments. Low-income enrollments have been steady in the private sector for a long time. High-income enrollments have been steady in the private sector for a long time. But private school education was out of reach for middle-income families. And so I think they're also going to be very attracted to universal school choice programs. So we'll see. I mean, we don't know for sure, but I think there's reason for some optimism that disadvantaged families are going to be part of the parade going forward.
Okay, I see a hand way in the back there.
Thank you, Paul. My name is Tom Talk. I run Future Ed at Georgetown, where Liz is my policy director. So I have an observation and two questions for Myles. I earlier in my career spent a fair amount of time in the independent school world, working closely with private schools that are very expensive. Their admission standards are quite high. One thing that became clear to me is that their business models are dependent not only on very, very high tuition, but the additional support of wealthy families through annual funds. That's baked into their business models, and they wouldn't be able to function effectively without that. So it strikes me that, therefore, that a large number of the more established, more expensive, higher quality, if you will, independent schools, private schools that might be inclined to participate in ESAs under universal models would not be inclined to do so until more affluent families are available to participate in those programs, because they simply can't afford to take on very large numbers of lower income kids with $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, even $8,000 price tags. So that's an observation. Myles, my questions for you are, how do you respond to reports that some number of private schools are raising their tuitions now that ESA monies are available to them? And then on the sort of political side, because you did make the argument that there is sort of a political benefit of having more wealthy families participate in these programs. What do you see in your work across states the Catholic Church doing to promote these programs, which will help, as we saw from a couple of different charts, including the one that Pat shared with us, that these programs represent an opportunity to gain back market share that they lost from the charter sector, from charter schools.
I'll do my best to be succinct here and merge those questions with one answer. I think, in terms of the raising of tuition, I think, in large part, that one of the dirty, ugly parts of private school choice are those elite private K-12 schools that don't participate. And essentially, it's a lot of parents saying, I opted out of that. I don't want that in my door. It's kind of a horrible reality for some of the more elite institutions. But I think when tuition is raised for those that are of the same spirit, what existed prior was a false reduction in tuition. And in fact, it was subsidized by philanthropy. That's the reason why tuition was so low. So when they bring it up, it's probably not even at what the actual cost is. They still require fundraising. And I think in terms of Catholic education, I am hopeful, again, watching new growth strategies emerge. I am hopeful watching some of the folks in the charter sector who have been dismayed at the lack of rigor and aggression and return to merit, who are leaving the charter sector, coming into the Catholic institution, and bringing the charter philosophy to a growth strategy for Catholic schools.
All right, well, we have several hands in the air. We are also running out of time. So I don't know. I think I could run a lottery here, but I don't know quite how to do it. But I think we'll take one last question. So I know you've been very eager to say something, so go ahead.
Thank you. Specifically to some points that were made, sorry, Patrick, before you got here, about the level of funding matching the needs. So I'm from Indiana. Our amounts are tiered very little, and it's based on home address, not on individual students' actual need. Is there a dollar amount of tiering that actually gets it done for those higher needs, lower income families, excluding special ed? We have separate funding for that. But is there a dollar amount that gets it done, or is intentional diversity of socioeconomic status within each school community the only way to effectively serve those kids?
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of weighted student funding that's based on student needs and all that money following the child. That's the dream, that's the ideal. The devil's in the details, and it's pretty complicated to work that out. I think there are some good models that are striving towards that. In Florida, the McKay Scholarship Program is tiered based on severity of disability, type and severity of disability. So that helps put strong resources behind kids with really severe disabilities. So that's great. Ohio has a sliding scale for their ed choice voucher based on family income. But as you alluded to, it's still, it goes from small to medium. That's the scale. So it's still leaving a lot of resources out of what might be necessary to effectively serve a child. But I think there's a lot of pressure on private school choice programs to deliver some kind of fiscal benefit, to basically demonstrate that they can do an adequate job teaching or delivering education to children at a lower cost. And so I don't know that we're ever going to get every dollar to follow the child. But that I think that's the ideal, and that's what we should be talking about.
All right. Well, thank you all for a wonderful panel. And we'll take a 15-minute break and begin the next one on schedule.
Yeah. Talk about not going according to plan.